Now this seems a little technical, but I hope you will be drawn to this conclusion. The apostles were exercising authority. Very early, they did this thing with the Eucharist, where they combined the Eucharistic bread and cup in one, and prepared the way for something which must have already been happening in the time of the apostles and was complete very early in the church, where the meal would be separated from the Eucharist, would take place after the Eucharist if there was a meal, and the meal, so that by the time of Hippolytus, who writes one of our earliest very extensive kind of descriptions of liturgical practice, the Eucharistic fast that you don't eat before communion is already described in like the 200s, early 3rd century. So what you want to see for our purposes here is that the apostles and the church are exercising authority and have a tradition and a practice which is embedded in the New Testament and which is lived out in the communities that are writing the New Testament and reading the New Testament. And this began before the New Testament. As I said, Paul, think of the significance of this. Paul is the recipient of creedal traditions. He even quotes them. Here's a saying worthy of all acceptance. It's a saying already. He quotes this, and that would be a wonderful thing to just talk about are the things that Paul quotes, the very earliest creeds of the church. They antedate the New Testament and are quoted in the New Testament. St. Paul is the recipient, and he's also a bearer who passes on the tradition of the church. And the church, which has this authority to regulate its own good order for the liturgy, so that the Eucharist, so that we, as we grow, we have no calling as Orthodox Christians. We have no calling to recapitulate in detail the Apostolic Church. We are the Apostolic Church. We don't need to try to recreate, to recapitulate. That's what I mean. We have no calling to try to go back and repristinate, to relive what it would be like to be the early church. We are the same church. During the liturgy of St. Basil, the prayer the priest says after the placing the gifts on the altar, he says, "Receive this as you received the sacrifices of Aaron," and goes through Abel, right, all these Old Testament, and as you received, there are those sacrifices, receive them as you received those sacrifices, and receive them as thou didst receive this sacrifice, this same sacrifice from the hands of the apostles. We don't need to try to recreate, to jettison later liturgical development and repristinate. We have no calling to try to relive an earlier period, because the church, which is guided by the Holy Spirit, very soon is meditating upon its reception of the Eucharist and sees the appropriateness, under the guidance of God, of receiving communion separately, because it is a meal, but it's higher than a meal. And as they received communion again and again and again, it was just right. The church has this authority. The apostles establish officers. They establish bishops and presbyters and deacons, and it is a process by which was clearly happening in apostolic times, and was complete by the end of the 1st century in almost all places. And in fact, there are those that say it wasn't complete, maybe even in Rome, until the middle of the 2nd century, but those are actually based on an argument from silence. If you actually read it out, it might be a somewhat powerful argument from silence. But again, remember, we are not called to try to recapture. We have no authority to live according to the rules of the church in 110. We have the collected guidance of the Holy Spirit for 2,000 years, and we live in the covenant now, not then. In this process, you get to the famous quotes from Ignatius about the place of the bishop in the local church. Now, in almost all of our dioceses are rather larger geographically, to say the very least, than the dioceses over which Ignatius is speaking of. A church like Antioch has a bishop. He is the main celebrant of the Eucharist. Presbyters are his co-workers and council who celebrate the Eucharist who can celebrate the Eucharist with him and on occasion by delegation from him. That occasion has become standard, but nevertheless, the bishop is actually, which is why the deacon coming out at the beginning of liturgy says, he doesn't say what we all say at the end of a service served by a priest. In the name of the Lord, Father, bless. The deacon comes out and he says, bless, Master. So, when Deacon George was here on Pascha and he said that at the beginning of the Paschal liturgy, he actually wasn't talking to me. He was talking to Bishop Benjamin, and I said, blessed is the kingdom on Bishop Benjamin's behalf. Ignatius writes very clearly of the Eucharist and the bishop in the church. Now remember, Ignatius is writing from Antioch, where Paul withstood Peter to his face. And there is one bishop appointed in the church, and the bishop is a fulcrum point, because it is through him that the local church is in communion with the rest of the church in the world, with the church of the past, and with the church of the future, because the bishop passes on the apostolic succession. The apostolic succession does not operate merely, it does operate by the laying on of hands, but it doesn't operate by the laying on of hands alone. Apostolic succession, like the Scriptures, have meaning in the context of the covenant community. The sacraments of the church have power because of God's covenant promises. God promises us to be with us, to meet us in the water. That's His promise. God is faithful to His promises. So when we're baptized in the water, we die and rise with Him. Not because so many drops of water have magical power. Many of people from the Reformational traditions look at this as a magical view of baptism, but it's not a magical view of baptism. We don't have a magical view of baptism. We have a covenantal view of baptism. And the signs of the covenant operate. Whether, and see, this is the thing, following the Reformation, people tend to want to see these things as only operative insofar as I believe in it or really put my faith in it. And by this you hope to avoid magic and hypocrisy. Signs of the covenant are not dependent on your faithfulness. They're dependent on God's faithfulness. Signs of the covenant have power apart from your fidelity. This is the meaning of those stories in the lives of the saints of actors doing a parody in front of the emperor of baptism and somebody actually receiving grace through it because God is faithful to the sign. That's an exception to the rule because obviously a parody baptism is actually performed outside of the context of the church. And yet God, who can choose to be faithful. Have you ever heard those stories? There's a famous patron saint of actors, and he was doing a mockery of Christians, but they knew how to baptize. Somehow they did know how to baptize. So he was immersed in the water, and they were making great fun of it. And he comes up out of the water, and he says, "Wow, I really am a Christian." And everybody thinks it's a joke. And he keeps on saying it until suddenly they realize he's not joking, so they kill him.